Hey, welcome back, everybody. Joe Costello, Lake Speed. I feel like we've had great success avoiding little glitches here and there, but every now and again you're going to have one with our videos. So these guys are re-racking the film on the film projector.
Yep.
Oh, wait. Bottom line, we're going to get to it as soon as is possible. They're going to figure out the video. And if not, you know, we got the man who is in the video right here, so we're going to try to deal with it. But interesting, the conversation that was just happening off the air. We do not remain silent in between these sets. You were talking a little bit more about Spintron, and what Warren was saying. People are very interested in the pressure on the valve train, and Warren was kind of delving into that area a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the questions, or a couple of the questions, had been about, well, the Spintron doesn't simulate the effects of the pressure or negative pressure in the valve train, or I say in the intake tract in the exhaust. Well, you know, as Warren was talking about earlier, there's all of these dynamics, these pressure waves. Even Billy was talking about it in his, that you've got these pressure waves. So that pressure isn't static, it's very dynamic. And the whole other part of this to me is that, okay, so if you take the fact that that's a variable and it's going to change engine by engine, well, by not having that, then you're reducing the noise that could confound your information, because really at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is make that valve train system stable. And the big key in it, going back to Randy and his excitement and everything jumping around, yep, baby with the thing, is that part going on in the valve train is the spring that's being energized. So when the spring is being energized, that's where you got to calm down, and you're never going to find that pressurizing the manifold. You're going to find it by watching that valve motion and doing it with the Spintron. So
there you go. All right, sounds like they've got everything re-racked and ready to roll. We're going to try once again. Back to the video, and then more with Ben Strader.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Ben at EFI University. Keith Jones from Total Seals with me again. And you know, the last couple of days we've spent a lot of time talking about surface finish. You know, what it is, what surface finish I want, how do you get that surface finish? You know, Ed at Rattler has been a great help in helping us get there. But once you achieve that, and maybe you got a machine shop, or you took your block to a machine shop, you got it back, everything's the way you want it, then you got to protect it. You know, we needed that surface finish for a reason, to help us with the whole break-in procedure and all that. But a lot of people tend to miss the fact that there's a pretty tight-knit relationship between the tune-up that the engine's got and the ability of that break-in to take place, you know, in a short amount of time. So Keith, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that guys face when trying to get the right ring with the right surface finish and then keep it that way until it breaks in. What are some of the issues you get?
One of the big ones, Ben, and it's a great point that this has been brought up. You know, you've done all this work, spent the money, you've done the machine work, you've done your research, you've found the right parts, spent all the time, put it all together, stuffed it in the car, we're ready to go. And at this point in time, there was a very, we'll say, narrow, tight little fragile relationship between the ring, the cylinder. The ring is the final hone. It's the final process of getting that cylinder finished just what it wants. It needs a little bit of friction. It needs oil. It needs everything to happen at the right point, right time. We put it together.
So if I was waxing my hot rod, the ring is basically my 1,000 grit wet sand at this
end. This is it. We're that final, you know, we're going to color sand it and just get that surface just perfect. That's that last step of that initial break-in. So the thing that we run into it a lot, and it's fuel wash during break-in. We've always been taught, you know, father to son, son to daughter, to their children, that a fat tune-up's a safe tune-up.
Sure.
Well, maybe there's some validity to that. From my side and where I sit, this is nothing but bad. We're introducing too much fuel. We've got a very fragile relationship now between the ring and that cylinder wall, the oil, and we come in and we literally pour a solvent in there. We break the oil film down so it has no ability to lubricate, and we ultimately end up burnishing the cylinder wall. Instead of wearing those fine peaks down and getting that really beautiful finish, we end up rolling all those peaks over and folding the metal. Now, this is easily seen when we take the engine apart. Instead of this nice, bright, silver, shiny, sparkly cylinder finish, we've got this dark, dull black. That's a burnished wall.
So Keith, what usually takes the abuse? Is it the ring or the cylinder wall?
That's an excellent question. It is the cylinder wall.
Okay.
99% of the time, I've seen the rings that have come back out. They're perfect. There really is no damage to the ring, but we're back apart. back out of the
all
car.
that work over again, right?
We got to hone it again,
Yep.
put it all back together, and hopefully, we'll say on this second or third time around, we've done our due diligence and gotten a good fuel map into this thing, whether it be fuel injected or carbureted. We've got the fuel curve pretty close to right, so now we can get it broken in and get everything seated up and get it happy.
So we have a little drawing behind us where we spent a lot of time talking about the surface finish, the peaks, the valleys, and how that valley is a reservoir for the oil, right? So you kind of drew here, this would be our cylinder wall, and the purple lines are those kind of peaks and valleys. Now the orange in there, that would be the oil that's filling that reservoir. That's what's doing the work of that reservoir.
That's our storage tank.
Yep. So we come in here and we do the old-fashioned safe tune-up. You know, rich is safe and fat is good and everything else. And what you have is the fuel droplets here that are, you know, we're not using them for combustion. So what happens is it becomes a solvent, and that fuel dilutes that oil mixture, basically washes it quickly off the cylinder wall. And now there's nothing to really protect that high friction loading between the cylinder wall and the ring, right?
Damage done.
Yeah, so obviously if a guy just buys a new carburetor and puts it on the engine, it's probably going to run pretty good. Do you see more problems on the carburetor side or the EFI side?
Not to pick on EFI, but I'd say it's probably more to the EFI side, simply because it doesn't have, and you're the expert here.
That means that's great. I got more work to do.
It does not have a proper startup map in it.
Sure.
Many of the guys that I get that we'll say are very much novices, the guys that need to come and see Ben and take the class, myself included, because I'm no expert, will fire this thing up. It's just fat as could be, and 3-4 days, a week, a month later, they're going to finally get it to somebody that can do some tuning on it. Well, at this point in time, the damage is done. But it can happen with a carburetor. I have had the instances where, you know, 14 pounds of fuel pressure is going to lift that needle and seat, and it's going to just be gobbling fuel like it's going out of style.
Yeah, we've all seen that, right?
It does
have
happen.
Pressure, it holds the you know, float bowl's full, it holds the needle and seat open, it dumps right in there. So how long do you think it takes on a brand new, perfect, fresh startup? You know, how bad does it have to be? Are we talking like, you know, only a few guys ever see this happen if they get really unlucky? Or is this a common thing, like really washing that oil?
This is a common thing. This is I don't want necessarily say a daily phone call, but certainly a weekly phone
That's
call.
a lot. I mean, that's 52 times a year.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a lot.
at least. And I will say, there's more than just myself to shop.
Yeah.
So multiply that by at least 3 or 4.
So, you know, I don't want to paint the picture that the engine's delicate per se, but the reality is, I mean, if we're using, you know, microscopic measurements to see how sharp those little peaks are, then it's really not that hard to fold them over rather than, work them in like you're honing that
Slowly, let them work their way down. Wear them off, not, roll them over.
So we want to be extremely careful about the initial tune-up for the engine, especially with regards to flooding the engine. You know, if that happens, stop. Just, let's take the plugs out. Let's get that fuel out of there.
Absolutely 100%. Again, working with guys, they'll talk to them, they've got this problem, it's smoking, it's got blow by, it's got all these, and we discuss, hey, tell me how it went. How did the initial startup go? Oh man, it took us 3 days to get it started. We had fuel running out the tailpipes. It's, wrong pumps, wrong injectors, wrong this, and we finally got it running. Damage done. This is an engine that hasn't even started yet, and it's already been hurt.
I think it's easy for guys to say, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that because I have a carburetor. But you know what happens a lot with a carburetor engine is they'll put the distributor in 180 out. So you're cranking and cranking and cranking, and the thing doesn't start, and it's popping or banging. Well, the same thing's happening there as if I had a bad tune-up in my startup map for an EFI system.
Absolutely. That draw on the intake stroke is still signaling that carburetor. It's still pulling fuel in, and every time it doesn't start, what are we doing? We're hitting that accelerator pump a few more times, and we're just loading it down with fuel.
So is there any validity or truth to the idea that, oh, well, eventually the rings will seat? Like if I've done that, if I've washed the fuel out, the oil off because of the fuel, will it eventually come around, or am I pretty much...
You're pretty much done.
Okay.
you might get lucky, and if they did come back in 6, 7, 8,000 miles later, I tell you, go buy a lottery ticket that day, because you're about 1 in a million guys that got lucky enough to have it come back in, because pretty much damage is done.
And so, what are the typical symptoms? My engine's sick. What are the symptoms that a guy would have if he had washed the oil off and had trouble with the rings? What are some of the things he could look for?
Typically what we just discussed, we're going to have a blow-by problem in it, but the most prominent or prevalent is an oil control problem.
Okay,
we
got smoke out the tailpipe.
We've got smoking out of the tailpipe. We've got blow-by because we've literally folded that peak metal down back into the valley, we talked about that reservoir, that trough. Well, I've taken that peak and I've folded it over, so now the valley, it can't hold any oil. It's filled with the other metals.
We capped it, basically.
We capped it. So we basically got such a smooth, burnished surface now, we've lost the ability to hold oil, trap oil. Blow-by numbers are generally going to be higher, not horribly, but typically the sign is we've got an oil control problem that we can't explain. We really shouldn't have an oil control problem.
Maybe a guy's middle of the road engine builder doesn't have, say, a blow-by meter. You'd be looking for things like wet exhaust ports, right? Like you take the headers off and there's oily, just wet stuff in there, oil on the spark plugs, smoke out of the tailpipe, high oil consumption. And another one is do an oil change and sniff the oil, right?
This is perfect. And not to get into too much depth, I had a customer that kept fuel washing the engine, tearing the rings up, 3 different rebuilds. Engine was dynoed. Everything was fantastic, no issues. Well, at the end of this whole cycle, come to find out, the guy's not running the carburetor that was on the dyno.
There you go. Yeah.
He sends me the oil. I'm like, dude, you got to send me the oil. I want the oil straight out of the car. Don't do anything to it. Send me the rings again. Let me look at them. He sent me a little Pepsi bottle full of oil, and I was going to send it out to Speed Diagnostics to have it checked, but I didn't need to, because after it sat on my desk for an hour, the fuel settled out of the oil, and it was like, C12.
Yeah, no smoking, right?
No smoking in here. And that all came down to the place that dynoed the engine ran on their dyno carburetor, which was fantastic.
Sure.
A Holley carburetor.
Take that off, though, and now you go
and
home.
Put on a Quadrajet.
Sure, yeah. Or even another Holley that maybe wasn't tuned to it or whatever, right? But so that's interesting that you bring that up, because a week or so ago, I was actually doing some back-to-back testing on an engine with a brand new, one of those really slick Generation 3, they call them Gen 3 Holley Dominators. I don't know if you've seen them, they are slick.
Yep.
But a little, like a week and a half ago, Holley released a new product that was called the Terminator X, where it uses like a carburetor-looking EFI throttle body. It looks identical to the carburetor, except it's EFI. And so I did some testing back-to-back on the same engine, and what I wanted to see was like, A, is there any difference in power between them? Obviously, that's what everybody wants to know. But really what I want to know is, how much work is it going to take me to get these things to run? So what I want to do is take you guys to the back, and I got both of them on the bench next to each other, kind of taking it apart a little bit, and walk you through the differences between carburetor and EFI, and then talk a little bit about the relationship of how we're going to get that tune up right. And I'll just do spoiler alert now. Ultimately, they pretty much made identical power, but that's kind of what you'd expect from a carburetor type throttle body and a carburetor.
Yeah.
The difference was, holy cow, was it a lot of work to get that carburetor to be as good as the EFI in really short order. We made a couple of hits on the dyno, boom, that thing was running. And I'll show you guys how we do that. But ultimately, it wasn't so much I thought there was going to be a big difference in power. What I wanted to know is how much work it was going to take to get a tune-up that was acceptable. And I think one of the things that's happened in the industry is we're at what a great time to be in the racing industry, what a great time to be alive, because the technology has come to a point where we don't have to do that much anymore. You know what I mean? Like, we've come to think, carburetor tuning's easy. Well, it's not that carburetor tuning's easy. It's just that when you got it out of the box, most of it was already done for you. We have 80 or 100 years of guys tweaking and tuning carburetors. So the end product that a guy gets now is so good, you can put it on 10 different engines and it'll fire right up and run and go. And maybe you tweak a jet here, power valve there, whatever. But for the most part, the real work was already done. Not so much with EFI. I mean, EFI's been around good 20, 30, 40 years now, but the state of refinement isn't anywhere near what a carburetor is. And so I think what is largely a problem for you guys is people start out with this idea for a project, they build this whole engine, they probably listened to a couple of your seminars and they went and talked to their machinist and they got all that stuff right, but they didn't really have the knowledge or skills available to get that refined tune-up to hit go, and that thing fires up and starts. And I think that's where a lot of that kind of fuel distribution issue, fuel washing the cylinders came from. But what's exciting about some of these new products is Holley realized that was a problem. And who better to realize it than Holley, who does nothing but make fuel systems. Yeah. So they said, what if we could give you an EFI system that not only looked and acted like a carburetor, but you could start it up and get your car running as easily as you did with a carburetor. And so they did a fantastic job with that. I was very impressed. If you want, we can walk to the back of the shop and I'll take a couple apart and show you, and we'll talk about it a little bit.
Love to see it.
All right, let's go check it out. Hey guys, okay, check it out. We're back in the shop here, and I've got a couple examples of new generation Holley equipment that could maybe make your life a little bit easier in terms of getting starting up and running quickly and accurately as fast as possible. Now, whether you're a carburetor guy at heart and you'll never change, or you embrace the new technology and you're really interested in the EFI stuff, I got a little bit of both to show you. So I thought I'd take a couple minutes and point out a few cool things. So on this side, what I have is an 1150 CFM Gen 3 Ultra Dominator from Holley. Really, really nice improvements they made in these carburetors in terms of the way that they're radiused in here now, the way the air bleeds are all located easy to get to. They even added an idle air bleed like on an EFI car where you've got an idle air adjustment that you can make. You basically can go right here in the middle of the carburetor, and there's 4 holes that go around. I don't know if you guys can see those or not, but those are basically adjustable amount of air that you can use to get the idle speed you want. Rather than the old-fashioned way to come over here and grab the idle stop and turn that, the reason that you don't want to do that is even though it's raising the throttle blade and giving you more airflow, it's changing the relationship of the throttle blade to the idle transfer slot in there. And then what happens is as you start to open the throttle, you get a lean or a dead spot there as you've used up most of that idle transfer slot, and there's not quite enough signal yet to start pulling on the main circuit. So this is what we call a 3-circuit carburetor. It's got an idle circuit, an intermediate circuit, and of course a main circuit, rather than just an idle and a main circuit on a 2-circuit carburetor. But Holley made some really nice improvements to those areas there. And you know, one of the things that I mentioned when I was in there talking to Keith about how simple it seems like it is to tune a carburetor is that most of the work has already been done. You take a look at just how elegantly complex a carburetor really is. Now on this Gen 3 Ultra Dominator, they have billet metering blocks. The metering block is the part that actually is doing most of the work to get the tune-up right. And you know, you got, obviously, for those of you young guys that don't know a lot about carburetors, I'll just start from the beginning. You have the fuel bowl. That's basically my reservoir. So my fuel line comes in, and there's a needle and a seat right here, a spring-loaded valve, basically. The fuel comes in, it goes past that valve. Now, on the back side, it's got a float. And as this bowl fills up, that float raises, and it basically pushes that needle and seat and closes it off. So now my fuel just waits there until the engine uses up the fuel and the float sinks. That valve opens back up, and so this float basically acts like a governor. So the first thing a guy wants to do with his carburetor is make sure that the float setting, the height of that, is properly. And they got little glass windows here that you can look on the side. So what you want is the fuel level, when the car's level or the engine's level, to be about the middle of that window. What can happen if you get a little piece of trash in there is that that needle and seat can't close. Well, when that happens, it just keeps filling the fuel bowl, which then transfers that fuel out of the bowl in this vent, and it tends to go over here and pretty much flood the engine. So when Keith and I were talking about protecting that cylinder finish, that's one of those things you want to watch out for. So you can grab a wrench and a screwdriver, and you can unscrew this and actually pull that needle and seat out and remove any debris in there. So that's really a good thing to check before you go to start the engine, or in this case, even turn your fuel pump on. And make sure that your float levels are set correctly. That way you're not dumping a bunch of raw fuel in the engine, washing that fuel off the cylinder wall, and then our rings can't see. So that's the first thing. Then we talk about, well, geez, you know, carburetors, just take them out of the box and they work. Well, they only work so well because for the last 60 or 80 or 100 years, companies like Holley and other tuners have made all the adjustments necessary. So if you just look at how complicated this little metering block is for a second, think about what's going on here, you might understand what I'm talking about. So most people who have ever looked at a carburetor are familiar with the main jets. That's these two guys here. What these are is a calibrated orifice that you can screw in, and they're interchangeable. Holley makes tons and tons of different size jets that are precisely made. They're broached, and then they're flowed and measured to make sure they're just perfect. So what you don't want to do is go in there with a drill bit and hog those things out and make them bigger, because then you can't really control precisely the amount of fuel flow you've actually got. But you can go up or down in sizes, and that basically takes care of the overall amount of fuel that the engine gets in any of the, you know, the basic driving conditions. So it's kind of a gross change. Next to it, there's these tiny little restrictors here. I don't know if you guys can see them super well here, but these are our intermediate circuit restrictors. And basically they're a little jet that determines how much fuel or how much air is going to get into that intermediate circuit. And then if we turn around to the other side, we see this thing here. This is called a power valve. It's basically an engine vacuum actuated sort of high power fuel circuit. If I unscrew it here, you can see what happens is, I'm going to take the little gasket off. There's a hole where fuel can get through, and then inside here there's two little jet restrictors that can also be tuned. You can take a screwdriver, you can put it in there and unscrew that, and you can put a bigger or a smaller restrictor there. That's called a power valve restrictor channel. And what a lot of people don't know is that the numbers on the power valve, for example, this one's got a 5.5. Well, that indicates when the fuel gets delivered through that high power circuit, not necessarily how much. I've heard people talk about, oh, I've got a high flow power valve, so I'm going to get more fuel. You're really not, because it's the size of the orifice and the power valve channel restriction that controls how much fuel you get. Your power valve, for example, this one's 5.5, means that whenever the engine vacuum is below 5.5 inches, meaning when you open the throttle, that's when this spring-loaded vacuum actuated circuit will open, and at any manifold vacuum below that value, it'll supply fuel from the circuit through those channel restrictions. But having a bigger or a smaller number of power valves is not going to give you more fuel, just earlier or later delivery to that fuel. Now along the side here, there's a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on either side. Those are called emulsification air bleeds. Their job is to mix air and fuel before it gets into the metering circuit and goes into the actual booster venturis in the carburetor there that are supplying it to the engine. So the really sophisticated tuners can get in there and change the size and amount of those air bleeds. Some of them you can plug off if you want to take air away. You can put bigger holes if you want to, put more air in, and so on and so forth. And on the other side, on the side here, you can see those are our idle mixture screws. Again, the idle mixture is really controlled by the size of the idle air bleed here. So that screw goes through, there's a little channel that comes up here, and that's called an IFR, an idle feed restriction. So my idle feed restriction really determines, what kind of fuel mixture I'm actually going to get, whereas your screw is just moving the volume of air and fuel that's going through that restrictor. So what I'm getting at is, I'm not asking you to be an expert carburetor tuner, because I certainly am not, but you can see that there's a lot more going on here than just taking out of the box, changing some jets, swapping in a power valve and going, hey, I'm a tuner. Well, the same thing happens a lot in your EFI system where guys go, I got a base map and my engine starts up and runs. It's not perfect, but it's okay. And then they just go plus, 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 or minus, 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 and now I'm a tuner. Problem is, when you get into that scenario, it's real easy to have a startup calibration that's not great, that's a little bit off. Keith was talking about getting excess fuel and diluting the oil on the side of the cylinder wall. So if we don't get the tune-up right immediately, we can run into problems with actual engine health, pretty quickly, and of course even down the road. But I wanted to point this out mainly because I get so many people say, oh, carburetors are simple. And I'm like, they're not simple. The work has just already been done for you. And where the trouble comes is when guys switch from carburetors to EFI. So Holly realized that was a problem, and they said, well, what if we made an EFI system that walks and talks and looks and smells like a carburetor, but has all the benefits of EFI? So you can really see the difference here. I've got this fuel bowl off. In this fuel, I took it off, and there's floats, and there's an accelerator pump, and there's a metering block, and jets, and a power valve, and restrictors, all these tiny little pieces. Actually, the EFI side's a lot more simpler. What we have inside the bowl here is, the bowl is just a decorative cover for these 4 fuel injectors. And of course, there's 4 more on the other side as well. And then this little electric motor here is controlled by the computer. That's basically a plug that opens or closes in the idle bypass restriction. So if I want the idle speed to increase, it just takes that little motor and uncovers the hole and more air bypasses. And of course, it's dynamic. It can happen in real time. Difference between that and the carburetor, well, if I don't like the idle speed on the carburetor, I gotta open the hood and walk out there with my screwdriver and fiddle around with it and go, okay, I finally got it good. And then I close the hood and I get back in the car and I drive around and I go to a different location or a different racetrack, or the weather changes. Now the carburetor needs some adjustment again. I gotta play around with all those circuits, play with my idle settings, play with my bleeds. So even though eventually we got to the point where we could make the same amount of power on the dyno, the difference was, in my Holley, Terminator X4500, I just put a couple of parameters in and asked a few basic questions, which I answered. The engine started and ran, and it had a tune-up that was super close. My carburetor started up and ran, but in order to get it to make the same kind of power that EFI did, it took a lot of work. I'll bet you we spent somewhere in the neighborhood of about 15 dyno pulls, changing things in the carburetor to eventually finally get it just as good as what took about 2 dyno pulls with the Terminator X 4500 here. And the real difference is now I can put the Terminator X on put the engine in the car and go. I go race in Denver, I go race in, Death Valley, California, I go to Florida, I go to Wisconsin. Doesn't make any difference because it's constantly making changes to keep the tune-up the same. Carburetor, not so much. So what I'll do is I'll point out some stuff for you here. I'll bring my laptop over so you guys can see it a little bit better. This is the main fuel table in the Holley Terminator X for that Sniper system. So you have your fuel injectors, you have your throttle body that looks and acts just like a carburetor, but basically this table here is our main metering system. So all of this is manifold vacuum here, and this is RPM here. The values in the table are simply just how much fuel the engine's going to receive at that point. Now, that is just like our carburetor, the overall kind of mixture control. But in the carburetor, we had a lot of little extra circuits, like, for example, the idle circuit, right? Well, we have that. If we go over here, there's a little icon that looks like a tachometer. And I press on that, and it's got little settings for what is the idle speed that you want based on the engine temperature. How many of you guys have ever had a carburetor that idled good when it was cold, then you had to fiddle with it when it was hot? Or maybe it was great when it was hot, but it didn't do that good when it was cold. One of the advantages of the Terminator X, I just say, at each temperature, I can pick the idle speed I want, and it automatically does that. What a great advantage. So you're not trying to get that thing working right and protect your hard-earned, effort and money that you spent getting the machine working the engine right, worrying about the tune-up changing all the time. So once we've got it idling and we're pretty happy with our little base tune-up here, we go down here and we go, what's this table? This is my accelerator pump. On the carburetor, there's a little lever, a mechanical lever here that sits on the side, and it actually goes this way. So as you move the throttle linkage, it presses on that lever. Fuel enters from the bowl down into the little diaphragm reservoir, and when you squirt this, it goes poop, and it squirts a bunch of fuel right out into the engine, just to cover up that dead spot. When you start opening the throttle quickly, the air rushes in, and it takes a little moment for the fuel to get in through the metering block and through the restrictors and into your discharge there at the Venturi. So in your EFI system, just like you had there, you have a table, you go in, and it's how fast you're moving the throttle and how much extra fuel it should get. So now I have a tweakable, tunable accelerator pump system. In the carburetor, I had to change the cans, and I had to change the squirter size and all that kind of stuff, and it was constantly working on it, draining the fuel bowls, filling them back up. You can ultimately do the same thing with a carburetor or an EFI system. The difference is my hands don't smell like gas when I use the EFI system. So what I want to do is, maybe you're the guy that's thinking, that all sounds great, but I'm really intimidated by this software. That laptop thing, plugging in a cable, that's scary. You know what? Holley's got an answer for that too. You come over here, it's got a little handheld 3.5-inch screen. It's touch screen. It's got one little plug-in. What I'll do is I'll take you guys over to the dyno, and I got one of these things sitting there ready to run. We'll plug this in, and I'll show you just how easy it is for you to go boop, 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 and get your engine up and running. That way, you don't have to be a tuning expert. Just like when you bought a Holley carburetor and it worked out of the box, with a few simple questions that you answer here, now you've got an EFI system that will just work out of the box. You're going to be happier because your engine runs right, you're not washing that fuel off the cylinder wall and hurting the piston rings, and you're ready to go a lot sooner. And you know what? The end goal is to make a bunch of power and go play with the car, not necessarily have a million tools available that I can tweak and tune. I don't want to do that part. I want to go play with the car. So I'll tell you what, let's plug this thing in and go check it out. All right, guys, welcome to the dyno cell. Before we wrap this whole thing up, I want to give you a first-hand look at what it takes to make one of these things work. So I got one of our dyno mules here from the school. This is a 350-inch, basically loosely based LS7 engine. So pretty much an engine's an engine. About the only difference with this one is we run a lot of different configurations of ignition setups and cranks and cam triggers and things like that. So if you wanted to customize your Terminator X, you could certainly do that. But if you have the more traditional small block, big block, and you just have a distributor and maybe a good old MSD box, anything like that, super easy to hook this thing up. So let's walk through it real quick. First, what you have is the actual ECU, the engine control unit. And the Terminator X is cool because, remember, you don't have to have a laptop. Even on the top here, it's got some LEDs, and I'll show you how they work real quick. Keith, if you don't mind, walk over and hit the ignition switch for me, the red button there on the dyno. All the way, there you go. Yep, go ahead. Just flip it on, and you'll see a bunch of lights come on up here. And what these lights do is they give me information about the system without me having to hook up a laptop. The first one here just tells me if the ECU has power. Why do I care about that? Well, a lot of times guys will say, I can't get my laptop to connect. Well, how do I know if it's a comms connection issue or if it's just I don't have power to the computer? Well, there's a light to tell you that. Then it's got status lights for whether or not the engine is running, whether the throttle position sensor is calibrated correctly, whether the O2 sensor is working. It's got lights to tell me the crank and the cam, are okay. So when you're trying to start your engine and it's not behaving and you wonder why, you can just refer to those lights and your little quick start user manual, you'll figure it out right away. And you go, oh, look, I left that connector unplugged. So that's the first thing. You can go ahead and shut that off for now just so we don't have any issues. There's a little hose here. There's an internal manifold pressure sensor. That's like your vacuum sensor, if you will. Now all you gotta do is connect your rubber hose, go to your intake manifold, boom, that's set up for you. Now, 2 connectors on the harness. You open the box, you get your ECU out, you pull the harness out. It's set up for this Terminator X4500. You really don't have to do much of anything other than plug that in, come over here. There's 2 connectors that go to your throttle body, and inside the throttle body I have all my injectors. Got my idle control valve, got my throttle position sensor. Comes over here and we have an intake air temperature that could go into your air cleaner or your hood scoop or whatever, or you can put it down here into the manifold wherever you like. You have an ignition connector that you plug in and that'll go to your distributor, or in my case, my crank and cam sensors. I have over here coolant temperature. Lastly, got an oxygen sensor that's in the exhaust. That's about it. You're gonna hook up power, ground, and 12-volt switched ignition, and you're going to be ready to go. Now, again, I said you don't have to have a laptop because Holly gave us a 3.5-inch touchscreen controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how easy it is to plug this thing in. Come on over here, and as I come down the harness, you'll see there's labeled connectors that say CAN. They match this connector. I'm just going to simply plug this thing in real quick. It only goes one way. You really can't mess it up. And Keith, if you'd hit the power for me again. As soon as we hit the power, I can see I got power up there. Now my screen is live. Now, Lake, I'm going to have you come in real close here and show you how easy it would be to set up a brand new configuration. Can you see here where it says Wizards? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch Wizard, and I want to create a new global config file for this brand new engine that's never ran before. And I want to make sure I get it right so I don't have issues with my ring seal and cylinder wall washing and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to touch that, and I tell it, is it multi-port injection, throttle body injected, or direct injected? Well, for ours, obviously the Sniper 4500 throttle body is a TBI. I hit next. Oops, sorry, TBI and then next. Now it just gives me parts numbers. Do you have a 4150 with 4 injectors, 8 injectors, or do you have a Stealth 4500? Obviously, we have the Stealth. We go next. I tell it how many cylinders does it have? Well, it's 8. And then I'm going to put the engine size in cubic inches here. This one happens to be 350, and I'll hit save, and I'll go next. What's my target idle speed? This thing has a lot of camshafts, so I might want to have an idle speed of, let's say, 1400. Boom. Save that. Pretty easy so far. Next, how big is your camshaft? It says below 235 degrees, between 235 and 260, and above 260. Well, this one's a little bit above that, and I'll go next. What type of ignition? If you have a GM LS, LSX with 2458, or you just got a coil CD box would be like if you had an MSD. So let's say we got that, and I say next. Oops, sorry. Next. And then your fuel pressure, 43 or 60. Mine set at 60. I go next. And check it out. This is really cool. Now it asks me, do you have any power adders? Do you have nitrous, turbo, supercharger? Remember, if you had a carburetor and you had an old reliable engine that's been running and you decide, you know what, everybody's doing all the cool stuff these days, I want to add boost, you're going to have to send that carburetor around and get all that recalibration work done, set it up for pressurization if you're doing blow through or draw through. There's a lot of work that goes into making a carburetor work, and honestly, a lot of guys run into trouble with ring seal from the tune-up not being right, all those other problems. Here, it's literally click a button. Now, my engine doesn't have power adders, so I'm just going to go next and say none. And then I'm going to tell it, now, there's a connector here. If I want to add that power adder, I can just plug in a multi-bar map sensor, 2-bar, 3-bar, whatever I want there. But remember, there's one internal to the box that I'm using, so I'm just going to click internal 1 bar. And that's it. It's ready. All I do now is say start. It will load that file in, and you're ready to start. So I'm not going to load this particular one in because we said it had an MSD box, and I really have LSX triggers. But that's it. I hit start. We can load it in. We'll cycle the ignition. We'll go out there and see if this thing runs. Once I do that, though, I can come back now, and again, I'm riding around in my car or I'm in the garage and I want to see what's going on. You can come over here and you can tune it. It's got some advanced features where you can select functionality, but most people use this multi-gauge monitor here, and you can see what all the sensors are doing. I've got manifold, coolant temp, throttle position, you know, my ignition timing, all that stuff is displayed right there on the screen for you. And you can make tweaks and adjustments from the screen without having to use the laptop. Now, if you want to be fancy, you get really in-depth and you really want to tweak and tune, that's what the laptop software is for, and it has way more functionalities and features, but not everybody wants that, which is what makes the handheld really nice. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to put this away. Let's walk out there and see if this thing will start. All right, guys, we're here at the console. I got everything hooked up, and basically I have my software here. I can see on my laptop or on the big screen, and I can see all the live data as I'm doing a run. But all I really needed to do was, you know, load that calibration in there and tell it I got this camshaft, this engine size, whatever. Then I can come out here and get the engine started. So basically I got the ignition on, I got fuel pressure. Let's see what happens. Here we go. You can see it fires up, and that idle circuit is already working with the bypass valve to try to target my speed. So now I just let the O2 sensor correct to my target. We're good to go. We'll let it warm up, and we'll see if it runs good.
What a day, what a day, what a day. Yeah, my brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.